Sara Grayson woke with a strange sensation. Her body felt immobile, as if bound by invisible ropes, and her lungs clenched in panic. She tried to move, but her limbs wouldn't respond. Only her eyelids fluttered open slowly, revealing nothing but pitch-black darkness. Breathing grew harder, as though the air around her was running out. At first, Sara thought it was just a dream, a nightmare she'd soon wake from. But cold reality hit her like a slap. Something solid and narrow pressed against her from all sides. She was lying in a box. She tried to scream, but only a hoarse rasp escaped her throat. Her fingers frantically felt above her head, sliding along smooth wooden planks. That's when the horrific realization struck her. She was in a coffin, and she was alive. A few weeks ago, Sara had fainted at home. A friend found her and called an ambulance, but the paramedics declared her dead. A medical error or a rare condition called suspended animation. But in that moment, they believed there was no hope. Her family buried her in a small cemetery near town, grieving but accepting the loss. Now Sara knew the terrible truth. She'd been buried alive. Her breathing grew rapid, and the air inside the coffin became stifling. She pounded against the lid with her fists, but the tight space restricted her movements. Each blow sent jolts of pain through her bones, but the wooden boards didn't even crack. She knew she only had a few hours of air left. Her fingers brushed against the small pendant around her neck, a gift from her mother. She gripped it tightly, forcing herself to focus. Her mom had always told her, "Don't stop, even when it feels like everything is over." The memory gave her the strength to keep going. Sara scratched and pounded the coffin lid, her fingernails splintering and peeling back to the bone. Blood smeared the wood as she fought against the suffocating darkness. Every minute dragged like an eternity, and then she heard it, a dull noise from above. Footsteps. Someone was walking nearby, maybe a cemetery worker or a visitor. Sara gathered every ounce of strength left and began pounding on the coffin in a desperate, rhythmic pattern. "Help! Please! I'm alive! Help me!" Her voice was raw and cracked, but she kept screaming until she heard the unmistakable sound of shifting dirt above her. Someone had heard her. A shovel scraped against the soil. With every muffled thud of the shovel, hope surged through her. Dirt trickled down as the coffin began to creak under the pressure. And then a tug from above. The lid loosened. Blinding light hit her face as the coffin cracked open. Sara squinted against it, gasping for air. The cemetery groundskeeper stood over her, his eyes wide with shock and horror. He reached into the coffin, pulling her out and dialing for an ambulance with trembling hands. Sara lay on the ground, inhaling deeply, panic and relief crashing over her in waves. Her lungs filled with the sweet, crisp air she thought she'd never breathe again. Sara Grayson lay on the hospital bed, exhausted and disoriented. Her body felt so weak that every movement sent waves of pain through her. The doctors explained that she had experienced a state of suspended animation, a condition similar to a coma, but with her body still technically functioning. "We almost lost you, but you're lucky to be here," one doctor said, trying to lift her spirits. "Cases like yours are extremely rare." Sara listened, but a lingering sense of unease gnawed at her. This didn't feel like a simple mistake. From the moment she woke up in that coffin to the moment she was found, something didn't sit right. Why hadn't anyone double-checked to make sure she was truly dead? And more importantly, who could have allowed such a horrific error to happen? A few days later, they discharged her, and she returned to her apartment. As she stepped inside, she noticed a faint, stale smell in the air, like the place hadn't been aired out for a while. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but her thoughts remained haunted by the coffin. The apartment should have been her safe space, yet it felt no safer than the grave she had escaped. She couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. Every night, she woke from terrifying dreams, her hands pounding against the coffin lid, her lungs burning from the lack of air. In those nightmares, she heard muffled voices above her, but no one came to save her. Each time she woke, gasping for breath, clutching her chest, convincing herself it was only a dream. One morning, while making coffee, she noticed something strange. On the kitchen table was a crumpled note with a few short words. "You were supposed to stay there." Sara froze. The handwriting was unfamiliar, shaky, as if written in a hurry. Her heart pounded wildly as she tried to remember if she'd seen the note before. But no, she hadn't left it there. Her hands trembled as she scanned the apartment. Nothing seemed missing, but everything suddenly felt suspicious. Who could have left that note? She was certain she had locked the door. Could someone have a key? But who? That same day, she had the locks changed. Still, peace eluded her. A few nights later, after a session with her therapist, she returned home to find the front door slightly ajar. A fine layer of dust covered the floor, as if someone with dirty shoes had walked inside. Terror gripped her instantly. Slowly, she stepped into the apartment, her heart thudding in her chest as she checked every room. The cabinets were shut, but when she opened one, she found another note tucked on the top shelf among her old belongings. "You can't escape." Sara's breathing hitched. Someone had been in her apartment, deliberately leaving these messages. From that night on, she slept with a knife under her pillow. She checked the locks multiple times before bed, but every morning, she woke with the same creeping sense that something was wrong. One morning, she noticed subtle changes. Her welcome mat was slightly askew, and a photo frame on the table was tilted. Someone was toying with her, making her feel like she was losing her mind. Her fear slowly turned into paranoia. She grew terrified of leaving the apartment, isolating herself from the outside world. Sleep became a distant memory as she stayed up, listening to every creak and whisper in the dark. And with each passing day, her worst fears were confirmed. Someone knew what had happened to her in that coffin. Someone wanted to hurt her, and that person was still out there. Sara was trying to find answers. Her paranoia was growing, and she began searching online for information about other similar cases. What she discovered was horrifying. Over the years, there had been incidents in the city where people were mistakenly declared dead. Some were rescued just minutes before their burials, but most of them had suffocated underground, trapped in sealed coffins. Sara felt her heart tighten at these stories. She could have become one of them. She decided to contact the doctor who had signed her death certificate. Dr. Langston initially avoided conversations, making excuses not to meet in person. He hung up on her phone calls and responded to messages curtly and vaguely. This only fueled Sara's suspicions. Eventually, she forced him to agree to a brief meeting at a cafe, but the doctor was acting nervously. His gaze darted around, and his hands trembled as he said, "You need to forget about this, Sara. Some things are better left in the past." "What do you mean?" she pressed, leaning closer. Langston looked at her as if he knew more than he was willing to say. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I had no choice. It wasn't my mistake. I was forced to sign that document." Sara felt her blood run cold. "Who forced you?" Langston didn't get a chance to answer. He suddenly grabbed his phone and almost fled the cafe. The next day, she learned he had died in a strange accident. His car veered off the road and crashed into a tree. The police deemed it an accident, but Sara knew it was too suspicious. He had known something important and hadn't had time to tell her. Time passed, but life didn't get easier. She tried to explain the situation to friends and family, but they only shrugged. "Sara, you need to rest," her brother urged, trying to remain calm. "It's just the aftermath of trauma. You went through a horrific experience, and your mind is playing tricks on you." Her friends were even less patient. They increasingly avoided meeting her, believing she had fixated on her story. Therapy wasn't helping either. The horrors wouldn't let up, and each session only intensified her feelings of despair. Sara was left alone with her fear, and the more she sought help, the deeper she sank into hopelessness. One sleepless night, Sara sat in her dark living room when she suddenly noticed movement outside the window. Against the backdrop of the night moon, she saw a shadow dart past. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the kitchen knife she hadn't put down for days. "Just my imagination," she told herself, but a dull fear was already pulsing in her chest. Then she heard it, a whisper. barely audible, as if voices were rising from the ground and murmuring through the window. "We will come back for you." Sara froze. She knew the house was locked, and the locks had been checked multiple times. But the shadows darted past the window again. When she rushed to the window and looked outside, the yard was empty. She stepped back from the window, trying to calm her breathing. Just then, from the other side of the apartment, there was a dull thud, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. Sara's heart raced. She moved toward the source of the sound, gripping the knife so tightly her fingers turned white. In the kitchen, everything was in place, but on the floor lay a note, new, fresh. She bent down and read, "Time is almost up." This time, the handwriting was even more disturbing, uneven as if written by a furious person. Sara felt her legs weaken. She realized someone had entered her home while she was in another room. From then on, she never stayed alone for a second, but it didn't help. Each night, the shadows and voices grew closer. She began to convince herself that there were places in the apartment she didn't even know about. Someone had been nearby all this time, and now they decided to make their presence known. For the last few nights, Sara had stopped sleeping. She sat in the corner of the living room, refusing to let go of the knife. Her body was exhausted, but fear kept her from closing her eyes. She knew that the moment she relaxed, they would come for her. And then she realized the most horrifying thing. It wasn't just about those who had signed her death certificate. Those who survived similar incidents weren't free either. They were haunted, driven to despair until they vanished, their cases left unsolved. And now it was her turn. Sara woke up on a hard bed in a windowless room. Her body ached, and her head throbbed with a jumble of thoughts. The air was stagnant, the walls a sterile gray, and the only piece of furniture was a metal chair next to the bed. When the door opened, a doctor in a white coat entered with a friendly yet cold smile. "Good morning, Miss Grayson. I hope you're feeling better. We brought you here after finding you in a panic on the street." "You're safe," he said, but Sara immediately sensed that something was off. This safety felt like a trap. She didn't understand how she ended up here and decided to uncover the truth. A few days later, Sara seized an opportunity when a guard momentarily left a storage room open. Sneaking inside, she discovered a filing cabinet filled with documents. Among them was her name, Sara Grayson, alongside others who had also been declared dead. But what frightened her more was the content. These papers described experiments conducted on those who had experienced pseudo-death, noting that most of the patients had been buried alive and not rescued. Suddenly, she heard a familiar, ominous rustling behind her. She spun around and saw the doctor standing in the doorway with that same cold smile. "Looking for something, Sara?" Her heart began to race wildly in her chest. "Why are you doing this? What's going on?" Her voice trembled. The doctor slowly closed the door and approached her, leaning in so close that she felt his cold breath. "We didn't choose you. Your case was ordered." Sara recoiled. "Who? Why?" The doctor sat down in the chair, as if savoring the moment. "Your father." Those words felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. "That can't be true," she whispered. "He would never." "Oh, but he did," the doctor sighed. "Your father owed a lot of money. Too much. Selling the company wasn't enough. Then he made a choice, your death in exchange for debt forgiveness. But a mistake happened, and you survived." Sara felt the world around her spin. "Why are you telling me this?" Her voice barely escaped her throat. "Because you're going to die anyway," the doctor smiled. "We can't allow you to survive again. This time, we'll do it right." That night, Sara decided to act. Her heart raced as she stole the keys from a staff member's desk and sneaked through the clinic's corridors. She ran as fast as she could, but as soon as she opened the exit doors, a siren cut through the night silence. She didn't stop. Heavy footsteps from the guards echoed behind her, but she managed to escape to an old cemetery visible a few hundred meters from the clinic. Sara slipped through the broken gates and hid in an abandoned crypt. There, in complete darkness, she covered her mouth with her hands, trying to hold back her breath. Her body shook with fear. Voices of the guards echoed outside the walls. Search here. She can't get away. Sara felt cold sweat trickle down her back. She was being pursued not only by people. It was the shadow of an inevitable end. And this time she knew her chances of salvation were almost non-existent. She had to survive. But what lay ahead was unknown. Sara ran through the dark streets, convinced that this time she had escaped. Her heart pounded so loudly that it felt like it was about to burst. The night enveloped her in a thick fog, and behind her, there were no footsteps or voices of pursuers. She reached the edge of the city, barely catching her breath. Finally, it was over, but at that moment, a sharp blow to the back of her head knocked her out of reality. Her body fell limply to the ground. The last thing she felt was the cold, metallic taste of blood on her lips. She opened her eyes in complete darkness. Her hands felt the walls around her, rough wood on every side. Sara froze. Her breath became rapid and panicked as she realized she was back in a coffin. She frantically banged her fists against the lid, tearing the skin until it bled. Her nails broke against the wood, and her fingers slipped, leaving sticky red marks. "No, no," she gasped, choking on her own scream. And then she heard it, a rustling, the sound of soil trickling down from above. First, it was slow like a light rain, but with every moment it grew thicker. The earth filled the space above her, thudding against the wooden surface. "Let me out," Sara cried, pounding her fists against the lid. "I'm still alive." But the soil continued to pour in. She felt clumps settling on the coffin, pressing down harder. Her breath became labored, her lungs burning from lack of air. She kicked and punched frantically, but the tight space constricted her like a vice. And then, through the thud of the earth, she heard a voice. A quiet, weary whisper that penetrated her very consciousness. "No one will help you now." Sara froze for a moment, and then erupted into a scream that turned into a wild gasp. She clawed at the lid, scratching the wood, trying to break free even by a millimeter. But the soil was pouring in faster, burying everything in its path. "I'm alive! Let me out!" Her cries resembled a hoarse wail, and her voice grew weaker by the second. When the earth nearly filled the coffin to the brim, she felt her lungs giving out. The air was running out, and the walls of the coffin closed in around her, squeezing her body like a blanket of pressure and death. Darkness clouded her vision, and the sounds became muffled. And just at that moment, she heard it again, the same eerie, sinister laughter. It echoed from all sides, penetrating her mind like poison. "You will die anyway." The mournful, smiling voice was the last thing Sara heard before the earth completely filled the coffin, cutting her off from the world. Sara tried to take one last breath, but only sharp pain echoed in her chest. Her hands fell limply. The world dissolved into complete darkness, swallowing her forever. Silence reigned beneath the earth. Like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what story you want to hear next. And remember, sometimes it's best to leave the past alone, because it might come back to haunt you.